is familiar to some of you, but in the interest of helping out newcomers here, I'm going to be touching on topic areas that really cover a background. And I'm going to start with our general plan. Every city, town, and county in California is required to adopt a general plan for their community. And generally what that covers is a forecast of what could happen in that community over the course of 20 years. We are operating under a current General Plan 2020, that was adopted in 2004. And that general plan is being brushed off and rethought, and we're doing an update to that plan, our 2040 plan, to take us from 2020 to 2040, and that's a citywide plan. We have a 24-person or 23-person steering committee that's assisting in this, several residents and representatives from the North San Rafael area. And so there's been a lot of discussion of North San Rafael, and particularly the areas around Northgate Mall. That plan is due to be released this summer, so I expect to see some information on that. What I wanted to mention is, through the course of preparing this general plan, we sent out a request to all of the homeowner and neighborhood associations throughout the community, because we have one part of our general plan which is called the neighborhood element. And if you go through that element, you will find that there's a discussion of every neighborhood in San Rafael, some of the unique conditions, and certain identifications of needs and other resources for those areas. And so as part of the request that we sent out is we wanted some feedback on any updates that we should include in that neighborhood element that are specific to neighborhoods. And we got some very clear requests from two communities, the North San Rafael community and the Canal and Greater Southeast San Rafael community, to program in our general plan for funding and completing a specific plan, a precise plan, or a neighborhood plan for portions of these areas. And essentially what that is we call it a deeper dive in planning. It takes a look at specific areas within our community that are at a greater level of specificity than we would typically look at in our greater plan, general plan for the community. Now, the timing and programming for a specific plan, a precise plan, a community plan, or neighborhood plan, all of these require funding certainty and outside funding sources. The City of San Rafael, we have a budget for a general plan. It's fairly limited in scope for that purpose. So typically, if we're looking at something other than that or beyond that, we look at outside sources for funding and grants. We are working on a downtown precise plan for our downtown area that's being folded into our general plan 2040. And that's the type of plan that we're looking at for planning out for either North San Rafael or both North San Rafael and Southeast San Rafael in the Canal neighborhood. That particular plan was funded by what's called an OBAG, or One Bay Area grant. And the reason why we were able to get this grant is because our downtown area is a priority development area, or what's been called a PDA. Many of you have heard the terms PDA, but priority development area. Ethan, could you move on to the next slide, please? And just some background on priority development areas. Priority development areas, or PDAs, were established with Plan Bay Area in 2007. Plan Bay Area is a regional plan that covers the 9-county area of the Bay Area region, and it looks at planning growth for 20-year forecast at a much higher level. And this is a plan that's typically prepared by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and Association of Bay Area Governments. And Senate Bill 743, which was a law that went into effect probably now 10 years ago, required that these regional plans consider finding ways to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the tools at looking at that is providing for more concentrated growth in the inner region of the Bay Area, generally around transit, and to reduce the amount of development further out in the hinterlands. And this PDA tool has actually two purposes. One is to try to plan for and look at areas where there could be more concentrated growth, locally controlled, of course. And then also, more importantly, that it's a funding tool. If you designate a PDA in your community, you have good access to funding to do planning for that particular area. Now, initially, way back in 2007, the PDAs were defined as a 1/2 mile radius around a rail station or a transit center or stop. And at that time, we designated our downtown smart station and transit center area and the civic center area around the smart station as priority development areas. And as a result of that, we were able to get funding to prepare station area plans for these two areas in 2011. Now, moving forward in 2013, there was some concern and controversy over parts of the recommendations for the station area plan in the civic center area. And ultimately, some of those recommendations in that plan were scaled back, and the city decided to remove or rescind the priority development area for the civic center area. And some of you, I know, I'm looking at your names here, I know you're familiar with some of this background because, well, it was 7 years ago. It's, in some respects, it seems like yesterday. And there was a lot of attention put on this particular topic. Ethan, could you move on to the next slide, please? So why do we want to consider this again, and what has changed since 2013? Actually, there's been a number of changes that have occurred that warrant us to reconsider priority development areas for San Rafael. As I mentioned, we still have one in our downtown area, and it funded our soon-to-be released precise plan for that area. I think most importantly is, first, the definition of a priority development area has been changed and broadened. While it still focuses for areas where PDAs are eligible around areas where there is access to transit, it's no longer this classic circle around a train station or transit center. We can actually, at a local level, form the boundaries of a priority development area to be very localized and focused, or very broad. And you're gonna see what we have in mind for the North San Rafael area in a few minutes. And that we have total control over forming those boundaries. And Ethan will go into more detail on that in a few minutes. Secondly, something that has not changed, and that is designating a priority development area does not impact local zoning or land use authority that's held with the city of San Rafael, and would not prejudice our general plan 2040. Further, there's no obligation to meet or zone for Plan Bay Area growth estimates. As part of their effort, they're going to be looking at growth estimates for the region, including specifically for PDA eligible areas, but we are not obligated to meet those growth estimates in our own planning of these PDAs. Next, most important, we're in a housing crisis, and in line with City Council direction, we've been asked to find opportunities to address the housing crisis and find ways to fund promoting housing. And then the last thing I want to mention, some of you are familiar with the regional housing need allocation. This is separate from Plan Bay Area. This is separate from our local general plan. This is a state law. Much like a general plan, we are required to zone for and actually meet certain housing requirement numbers for our community. And the regional housing need allocation cycles every 8 years, which means we have to open up our housing element every 8 years, which is part of our general plan, and take a look at that allocation. We expect that that allocation is going to significantly increase. So we have to find a way to address it. It's not something we're going to be able to address right now with the General Plan 2040, but we will be starting those discussions with the housing element within this next year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ethan, and he's going to get into more detail on the PDAs and what we have in mind for North San Rafael.
Thanks, Paul. So one of the big questions that's come up as we've been doing the PDA discussions have been, what does a PDA designation commit the city to? So Paul kind of mentioned this a little bit, but I think it's important to note that by state law, Plan Bay Area 2050 can only be strategic. And Plan Bay Area 2050 is the document that describes the priority development area. As part of that state law, it says explicitly that that plan shall not require a city's land use policies and regulations, including its general plan, to be consistent with that plan. So that kind of harkens back to Paul's comment that while Plan Bay Area 2050 can discuss housing density and housing growth estimates, that has no impact on land use policies and regulations. By state law, they have to be separate. What a PDA designation does say is that a PDA must have a specific or a precise plan adopted by 2025 to maintain the PDA eligibility. Why that's important is the PDA eligibility is what gives the city access to designated funding and resources for a community-driven planning process. So the specific and a precise plan, we can get a little bit into what exactly those are, but those are very detailed documents, and one detailed document like that would need to be completed by 2025. However, those specific or precise plans do not need to plan for Plan Bay Area 2050, those gross estimates, and they do not need to be limited to the PDA area. So what do I mean by that? We could conduct a specific or a precise plan for all of Terra Linda using the funding that we received for the PDA designation for Northgate. So really, the big piece here is that a jurisdiction can change or rescind those PDA boundaries anytime. As we go through a community-driven planning process, we may realize that the Northgate boundaries we want to change a little bit, or maybe we want to make them bigger, we want to make them smaller, we want to include one block that we didn't include before. We have that ability. Now, are those changes going to be reflected immediately? They're going to take some time. So the PDA process happens every 4 years. So if we were to change or to rescind the PDA boundaries, while in effect they would be changed or rescinded, they wouldn't reflect in the Plan Bay Area process until the next PDA update cycle. So where are we in that cycle? We're at the letter of interest process. So right now, MTC and ABAG are accepting local nominations of PDAs through what's called a letter of interest. Now, the submittal of a letter of interest was required by May 31st, and that needed to be signed by the city manager or the planning director. However, the thing that finalizes that submittal is an authorizing resolution, and that needs to be submitted by June 30th for all new priority development areas. Now, once there's an LOI that's been submitted and finalized, they still need to be considered for approval by the MTC ABAG board, and that's currently expected to go in August or September. Additionally, once approved by the board, they won't be included in the Plan Bay Area analysis process, and that process is called the final blueprint analysis until about September. So where are we today? On May 18th, we had a city council meeting where the city council considered the letter of interest for Northgate and Canal PDAs. City council did agree to submit an LOI for those two PDAs, but they directed staff to conduct further outreach before they consider an authorizing resolution that would finalize the PDA boundaries. And that authorizing resolution is required by the end of June to finalize the PDA, and we currently have it scheduled for the June 15th City Council meeting. Now, part of why we keep bringing this up is that we do really want to harken on the fact that a PDA designation will allow access to designated funding and resources to facilitate a community-driven planning process. So the decision right now is whether or not to pursue a PDA designation. If we pursue that designation, it provides us funding and resources to really kick off a much larger and more detailed community-driven planning process. So now that we've talked all about PDAs, I think we can jump a little bit into looking specifically at the Northgate PDA that was proposed. So this is a view of the eligible area, not the PDA. So as you can see, there's a bunch of different colors. It is a long stretch that reaches all the way down on Lincoln. The colors represent the criteria for how that area is being designated eligible. So the orange and yellow is related to the transit-rich area. And as you can kind of see, there's some kind of, you can kind of see the broad outline of that half-mile radius that Paul had described before. But as you can kind of see on the Freitas Parkway, that area is a different color. And that's related to a connected communities designation. And that connected communities designation refers to the headways, or essentially the frequency of the transit in that area. So the eligible area right now for the Northgate or North San Rafael is a large area ranging from immediately surrounding the Civic Center SMART train station and following the path of the SMART train along Lincoln Avenue. It includes Northgate Mall area in the PDA, and it would be consistent with the general plan policies. And there's just this one note that we wanted to flag that's part of the earlier elements of the Plan Bay Area 2050. And they're specifically looking for areas to transform aging malls and office parks into neighborhoods. This is a key strategy of this year's Plan Bay Area process. What Council discussed on the 18th was a much more limited PDA. So right now that limited PDA includes Northgate Mall, Northgate 3, and Northgate 1 centers. It also includes the Las Cainas office and gas station areas. What it does not include, though, is Mount Olivet Cemetery. It does not include areas east of Highway 101, and it also doesn't include the areas south and west of the Civic Center train station. So now that we've been talking for about 20 minutes, I'm going to open up conversations. Really what we're looking for right now is just a very high level questions. If there's anything that we discussed that wasn't quite clear, feel free to ask us those questions. I'm going to allow everyone to talk. So you're going to get a little ping that says you're allowed to talk. What we just ask is if you can raise your hand. There should be a way for you to raise your hand on the Zoom call. That'll allow us to kind of be more, allow kind of everybody to have an opportunity to talk. So the one person that I see right now is Rachel. It looks like you might have a question.
Yeah, I was actually just writing it in as a quote, and I'll send it. It may not be as refined. Some of the community concerns that I've heard or read through the comments associate a PDA to either lack of local control or a rubber stamp that there'll be increased housing. And I'm not seeing that those two are correlated. I mean, the concerns may come up for other reasons, but I'm not necessarily seeing that relationship between a PDA and those concerns. Can you specifically address that? Is this a guarantee, not necessarily a guarantee, but a correlation, I guess, PDAs are directly tied to those concerns?
Absolutely. Thanks, Rachel. Paul, did you want to handle that or you want me to?
Sure. Why don't you go ahead and then I'll supplement.
Yeah, so I think the big piece is referring back to the state law that created the Plan Bay Area process, or just this regional sustainable communities process. And so there is no correlation between a PDA and local control. by state law, they have to be separate. What a PDA is essentially doing is that the city is saying, we want to look at this area for priority development. And that could be that could be looking at jobs, housing, traffic, but the actual process that would change anything is the specific and precise plan process. So that has to happen at the city level. And when we talk about a community-driven planning process, that's what we're referring to. That's not just something that happens overnight. It's not something that happens with just designated a priority development area. It's a year or two long process that the city goes through, very, very detailed community outreach and very, very detailed analysis of how we want that area to look. And that, if you've participated in the downtown precise plan process that's currently been going on, it would be very similar to that, where it's a very, very community focused and very, very community engaged process.
Right. So just to confirm that we could have problems of people feeling of lack of control or lack of community engagement, whether we have a PDA or not. A PDA does not, does not say this is a predictor or a precedent for not having that control.
That's absolutely correct, Rachel. In fact, the local control issue surfaced with the first generation of Plan Bay Area back in 2007. And there was a lot of fear regarding the loss of local control, and that really mushroomed a lot. If you may recall, if you knew about what was going on back then, and a lot of it had to do with, at the time that Plan Bay Area was being drafted, there was also, at the same time, the state was releasing what's called the RHNA, the Regional Housing Need Allocation, which is required by state law. And I think what happened during that process is a lot of the community members, and rightfully so, because this stuff is very in the weeds planning stuff, and unless you deal with it every day, sometimes it's just a mystery. But the two got mixed up, and a lot of people thought that RHNA was Plan Bay Area, and so a lot of that, there was a lot of damage control that had to occur after that. And the nice thing is though, there's been an evolution of how PDAs are defined and their purpose, and there's even more assurances that regarding local control in using this tool. Right now than there was back in 2007. But just to confirm, no, it does not compromise local control at all. What it does, it gives us money to do our own planning with our own control.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, from my perspective, it definitely feels that we could have lots of priorities, and within the San Rafael community, there can be many, many priorities. And I think that identifying both Northgate and Canal for the San Rafael community it's a real message to say we want to work in these areas. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Were there any other questions? Susan?
Thanks. If you have to repeat some of this because planning is so got so many overlapping layers, can you just help refresh my understanding of how all of the community input about our priorities overall for the community in the general plan 2040 process intersects with this PDA? So that we're looking both at the very important concerns of the folks who live in the immediate area, but we're also incorporating all of the work that have been done about what we want for the city overall.
Well, we have, as I mentioned when I first started discussing the slides, that there was some quite a bit of outreach done to the individual neighborhood groups to take a look at the neighborhood plans. And the response that stood out the most had to do with these two areas, North San Rafael and the Canal neighborhood to do, with a request to find a way to do a more detailed plan for these two areas, find the funding, and place it as a high priority. So that is what we're doing in the general plan right now. We're putting a program in the plan to cover both of these areas that say pursue funding and complete a specific plan or a precise plan or something more detailed for these two areas and identified as a high priority. So that's how we've taken community input and put it into the general plan. That's one example. We've had some other things that have come up regarding other neighborhoods that we've considered that have also been included in the language of the update. So Susan, I don't know if that fully answers your
question. No, that was great, Paul, and thanks. Sometimes I think we have to hear these things 2 or 3 times as we're processing more and more layers.
Sure. And by the way, before we move on to more comments and questions, I just want to let everyone know that, and you probably already know this, we have the Priority Development Area website, and there are a list of frequently asked questions. And we're adding to that list as we've had these discussions like this one today on new questions that have come up that are common. So you might want to take a look at that FAQ if you have some certain questions, and there may be one there that answers your question. So.
Sorry, I was on mute. Claire, I saw you had your hand up.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
I see. Well, I think Susan asked my question, so I got it answered. But I would just like to thank you for your work in, trying to forward some positive planning. Just to echo what I said before, I think this area in San Rafael is really really calling out for some great vision, and I know the neighbors have lots of ideas, and I just think it would be great if we could take advantage of the funding in order to do something better here, more inclusive. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Philip, I see your hand is up.
Yes, I had a number of questions, but first a compliment. I thought this has been a very clear, logically well laid out story about what this is and how it works. So thanks for putting this together. Just following on the other question, even though in the general plan you identified specific plans for 2 neighborhoods, if we don't get a PDA, will there be a specific plan developed given the cost of it?
I think it depends upon the timing, Philip. What's interesting is, speaking of timing, when these requests came up, we saw this, what had been released by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission regarding the potential for PDA, and me having gone through this 7-8 years ago in the North San Rafael area, I can honestly say I wasn't really enthusiastic about revisiting this. The more I thought about it is, wow, this is a great opportunity to get money like we did for downtown that was fairly immediate. Well, not immediate, but easier to get than other sources. There are other sources out there. Let's just say we don't designate the PDA and we have these 2 programs in the general plan. It just may take longer, and we may have to tap other sources to get the money to fund them. The specific plan that was done for, or the precise plan that was prepared for downtown San Rafael, we got $600,000 to prepare that plan because of the PDA status. And that didn't even include the budget for the EIR, because we're doing an environmental impact report that we have to also prepare for a specific plan, which is a greater level of detail than our general plan just for the downtown area. And we had to supplement that using our own funds. But I think the big chunk of the $600,000 was because downtown was a PDA and we were able to get this funding. There are other sources out there. Actually, Ethan is the expert on finding money like this. There's Senate Bill 2 and other sources, but the problem is a lot of those are competitive and could take longer to secure. So this opportunity makes it a little easier for us to get money is really what I'm saying. So
Got it. And would we have to do an EIR for our specific plan for Northgate?
yes. And right now for the downtown plan, since the downtown plan is being prepared in conjunction with the general plan, we're preparing one EIR to cover the general plan, as I mentioned, at a very high level, and then a more granular and detailed level for downtown. But we would have to prepare an environmental impact report if we did a specific plan, a precise plan, or any other plan for the Northgate or the East San Rafael area.
And where would that money come from since you had to augment for the city? How would we generate that up here?
Well, we probably have to find funding sources. And it could be through this OBAG grant. It's just that we were able to qualify for $600,000 for downtown.
Got it. And because this is a smaller area, would the cost be less for us to do a specific plan here?
Yeah, because let me tell you what we're doing in the downtown plan. You might want to take a look at the downtown plan when it's released. We're doing what's called a form-based code. And if you look at the downtown plan, there is a lot of housing and jobs growth that we're looking at for downtown. And just remember, it's apples to oranges to Northgate, okay?
Yep.
Completely different context. You know, there's no interest in creating the density of downtown San Rafael here, but in that particular case, we included what's called a form-based zoning code, which is very detailed and was costly. So that ate up a lot of money in that budget. And the other part of it is downtown has a lot of historic resources. And the last historic assessment we did for our community, because our downtown is a mission city, and we have a lot of buildings that are well over 100 years old. We had to update that inventory, which was a huge cost. So that bit into the budget as well. So we had to split those dollars up based on those particular needs. North San Rafael, an EIR would have different needs, but it certainly, we're not talking about historic here or something other than something that's going to be real costly in terms of environmental review.
Who decides how much we get?
Pardon me?
Who decides how much funding we get?
You know, that's a good question. I can't remember whether when we asked for the money downtown, whether there was a cap. I think there was a cap on what we could request and that we had to come up with a matching amount. And I believe it was $600,000. So it depends upon what is available when they release the program and ask you to file for a request for money. Ethan, can you touch on that at all? Do you know?
Yep. So I believe the cap at the time was $600,000, which is what we received. And the match that Paul was discussing at the time was $50,000. So what the city did is we put in $50,000, and that got us $600,000 for the downtown precise plan.
Would you do the same for us up here?
I part of the reason why we would be wanting to do a PDA designation would be pursuing something very similar. We don't know the specifics of the grant application yet, but I would not be. Part of the reason why we're going about this process is specifically to fund that kind of community driven planning process.
Okay, final question. Is there any downside to this that you see?
I'll take a stab at that, Paul, and then if you want to respond too. I think, honestly, I think the name Priority Development Area is a misnomer. That's, I think, is the biggest downside, is that really it's more of a priority planning area than a priority development area. And for me, the biggest downside is that identifying it as a priority development area, I think you kind of lose sight of kind of what the city's trying to do. And what we're trying to do is really fund a community-driven planning process. In terms of the ability to change things or rescind the PDA boundaries, because of our access and our ability to do that, I don't see much of a downside.
Thank you.
You know, I have nothing to add to that, Ethan, other than to say that it's a shame they didn't rebrand this and call it something else, because it's got baggage from 10 years ago, the term PDA. And at that time, there was a lot of perception that there was a downside to loss of local control and an obligation by a regional agency and beyond for us to upzone areas and put in high density housing and all of that other, those other thoughts. But again, that a lot of that was a perception. And while there was some level of expectation by the regional agency, Metropolitan Transportation Commission, that if you designate a PDA, that you should put more concentrated growth in that area, there were really no obligation or mandates, as Ethan mentioned in the slide. That's why we keep reiterating, by state law, they cannot hold us to any sort of growth requirements that they, as in the regional agency, that they may have in mind for some of these areas that are around transit. We have what we call those shots, and that's why we keep repeating that, because a lot of people think that that might be the downside to creating a PDA.
And it's not.
No.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Scott, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I agree with what Paul said, or Phil said earlier. I think this has been a good job of information out. I think there's a couple of concerns that I have, and one of them is, Paul, you mentioned earlier that this is not necessarily similar to what happened to downtown. And I think that's the main concern that most of my neighbors have, as well as we don't want to see this as, this is a residential neighborhood. This is not a downtown vibrant area. And we don't want to see kind of like that being thrown on top of what we have here in North San Rafael. So I think that's a concern that we have, and I think that needs to be brought out. Two is also the housing. That's always a concern. Yes, we have a housing shortage here in Marin. We have to have, and this is an open area, which we can have a lot of residential building for that. I think there's a concern, obviously, with the number of units for that. So I think that's something that I think needs to be brought forward, and it needs to be addressed for this area as well. And I have two more ones. Is looking at the map here, the PDA scope, Marlo Geyer owns about 50% of that land. What if we go forward with a PDA and we approve it? What kind of boundaries or impact does that have on MG to actually go through and obey by it, or not, or do their own thing, or anything else like that? And I'll let you answer for that right now.
Certainly, I can answer that. Designating the PDA provides an opportunity for seeking out and securing funding to do a community-based specific plan, much like what we're doing in downtown. And I'm going to give you an example of what's going on downtown. Again, it's apples and oranges. And Scott, I'm glad that you brought up the whole context thing. That's why I keep saying North San Rafael is different than downtown. And there's no expectations that we're going to turn this into downtown at all, nor any desire for us to do that. We have to remember context when we do planning and moving forward. But when we agreed to do a precise plan for downtown, one of the questions was raised to the city council. Listen, we've got land development occurring at this time. We've got applicants who want to come in and develop their property. We can do two things. One was we can put the stops on any new applications until we adopt a plan, or we could just allow those projects to proceed on their own pace, go through their own process, and then look at those projects and where we are with the greater planning effort when it comes time to take a look at those projects. What the city council decided, at least in downtown, was that they knew that BioMarin was going through its own process, particularly to redevelop the PG&E property on 3rd Street, and they had already started their environmental review process. The city basically said, well, we'll let them continue with their process, but we're going to keep it in check as we move forward with our downtown precise plan, which is what we did. So it didn't preclude them from moving forward separately. And if that same approach were taken here, I mean, Merlone Geyer could certainly come in and file for an individual development application at the mall or Northgate 3 or whatever. They certainly could do that, unless at some point in the process, the city council says, no, you know what, we want this all to be considered at once. So it depends upon the timing of some of those things. The one thing I do want to mention, which is a little nuance to all of this, is the Northgate Mall being over 2.5 acres in size. If, let's say, the mall came in and wanted to redevelop that mall on its own, they would have to go through their own master plan process, which is more than what you saw for Costco. They would have to do a plan development zoning, which is much like a mini specific plan for this whole circle area that you see here. So they would be required by us to do that. And that's a very similar process to a specific plan. It's just that it's not community-based. It is initiated by a single property owner. Scott, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's essentially what happened downtown, and what, if we were to move forward here, I mean, unless there was something at a city council level that says, nope, we're not going to allow anything to proceed individually, that could happen.
Okay. I was part of some of the discussions back in September, October regarding the Costco debate, and it was loud and clear that the city council, not city council, the planning department and design review board, and many people wanted to have kind of like a visionary of this area to be put in place prior to just throwing something in there just because. And I think this PDA would actually help out with that vision and try to have a cohesive view and look and appeal to this area as well. So, and my last question, if I might, is you were saying that we went out and socializing a lot of it with the areas. At what point do we understand or think that we had enough input to make a decision? I'm asking this because here on the call, we have 7 people that have, at least called out at the beginning of the call, and a couple other calls. So say 24, say 30 people joining, but there's a lot more residents in the area. At what point do we say, hey, we don't have enough information to proceed forward, or going forward with that? So that's my last question.
Ethan, if you want to handle that, because you've been pretty much the point person on all this outreach.
Yep.
And because I know that while there's been the people that have been involved with these discussions, these Zoom meetings, there's also been input outside that forum with us from other folks that have not participated. So maybe you can touch on, how much and.
Yep. So I think it's a great question. The next immediate decision point is that June 15th meeting. So at that meeting, City Council will consider whether or not to move forward with finalizing through an authorizing resolution. So there will be a need kind of at that point because we have this June 30th deadline coming up. Now, I think what's important about this is that obviously this is not the ideal situation to be doing a large community outreach. Sheltering in place kind of prohibits our ability to do the kind of level of community outreach that we would otherwise want to be able to do. And I think that's why the fact that cities have the ability to change and rescind the boundaries is really important here. So if council does decide to move forward with those planning processes and with that PDA, as part of the planning process, if we get into it and say, this is not what we want, we have that ability. And we're able to change the boundaries, to rescind the boundaries. There is that capacity as part of this. So I think one of the good things that was brought up on the May 18th City Council meeting is kind of the reiteration. This is just the beginning of that process. And through each step of the way, we have the ability to kind of reassess where we are in that process and whether or not we want to move forward in that process. I think part of why there's interest in moving forward, though, is that we can kind of keep the conversation around PDAs continuing and around that, the conversation around a community-driven process continuing while still trying to kind of keep our options open for funding is the big one.
Yeah, and I just bring this up because I know you've done a lot of work. You and Paul have done a lot of work on getting the voice out and gathering information and everything. But I know that there's also a perception out there that a lot of this is being horseshoed in at the last minute. That, oh my God, we have two weeks to do this and make a month to make a final decision. And I think it's kind of like smoke and mirrors kind of perception being received out here in the community. So just thought I'd let you know that.
Appreciate it. And so I see Philip and Claire both have their hand up, and I just want to do a quick little time check. It's 8:56. So Philip had his hand up first, Claire. So I'm going to ask Philip, see if he still has a question. All right, Claire.
I just wanted to ask very quickly, if we rescind the boundaries and rescind the PDA, do we have to give the planning money back?
That is a good question. And Paul, do you want to talk
good about question? You know what, Claire, this came up last time when the PDA was rescinded because we received $250,000 to prepare the station area plan for the Civic Center. And the question came up is, did we have to return the money? And the response was no. While we rescinded the PDA at the time, we still held to accepting the station area plan with some significant changes. And some of those changes, like I mentioned when I first started, we are folding into the general plan 2040. And they were changes that were suggested, particularly along the Redwood Highway and Marydale Road frontage and a few others on the west side of the freeway that were acceptable to that community. So no, we did not have to refund the money. Now, that was 7 years ago. I don't know now if we were to rescind the PDA after we received $500,000 for a specific plan, whether we'd have to return it or not. But and Ethan, I don't know if you know any more about that than I do, but that's the way it was 7 years ago. We did not have to return the money.
Yeah, there's been no information either way. So kind of how we're moving forward is based upon the last round of funding.
So just one other question. In all of these meetings regarding the North San Rafael PDA, what's your sense about how people feel about it after they listen to your presentation in general? It seems like on this call, everybody has relaxed a little. Has that been your experience on other calls?
That's a tough question. mostly because I think there's a lot of there's a lot going on right now.
Yeah.
To be frank. So I wouldn't want to kind of make any kind of broad generalizations, just because we recognize that this is happening kind of during the middle of a shelter in place, during the middle of kind of larger issues happening in the community. So what's happening now may be a little bit different than kind of what might be happening, say, 6 months from now. So yeah, I would respectfully not want to answer that question.
Decline to answer. Okay,
Yeah.
that's fine. That's fair.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No worries. And Scott, I see your hand is up. We have about a minute. So
Yeah, real quickly, just to add to that is regards to the money that if PDA grant money is given to us and we rescind it later, whether we have to give it back or not, I think that's a very important key thing that we need to probably have a solid answer on regarding this PDA funding, not necessarily some years ago, because that will be an important key coming up for the city council to make a decision on. That's it.
great question.
Sounds like a great question for the FAQ list.
Sure,
All right.
that sounds great.
All right, so we're at 9 o'clock. I just want to say thank you. We didn't get to the framing questions, but that's okay. I'm going to put them up just if you want to take a look at them, and you can feel free to kind of send along any feedback that you might want. The main one is, do you support the proposed PDA? One of the questions that we had are the proposed PDA boundaries too big, too small? Kind of specifically on that, there's been some conversation around potentially expanding the boundary to include the area immediately around the Civic Center station, but that's just the kind of the two parcels that immediately adjoin it, not Mount Olivet Cemetery or Guide Dogs for the Blind. And then finally, if we do move forward with this type of community-driven planning process, what would that look like for the PDA? So we don't need to answer those now, but if you have something that comes up, feel free to email Paul or I kind of your response to that. That would be great. Otherwise, I just want to say thank you for taking the time. We know this is a new venture in how we're doing some of these community meetings. So I appreciate everybody kind of walking through this test run with us.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
All right. And with that, I'm going to end the meeting. Look forward to hearing from all of you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.